So our final presentation is from Arnav Kapoor, who is a self-described avid question asker, curious about how to best implement social change. Arnav previously worked in Kenya in the financial sector development and impact investing through microfinance. After engaging with Kenyan colleagues and friends, he found his work wasn't creating the change he would like to see and joined an early stage social venture that enables aid organizations to have conversations with their beneficiaries. He also runs a podcast called The Development Dilemma, which is how I came to find Arnav, and I definitely recommend the podcast. It's very insightful, but Arnav will have more to say about that. So go ahead.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Anna, for that. And thanks, SOAS, for having me. And so, as mentioned, my name is Arnav Kapoor, and I'm here as the host of the Development Dilemma podcast. And today I'm going to be talking about kind of the expansion of CSR into the kind of creating shared value space. And in particular, in terms of how to create those partnerships. And so with that, I'm going to focus on kind of three key aspects that I've learned. And that's firstly kind of focusing on context over knowledge. Secondly, the approach over the process, and then lastly, friendships over networks. And I'll go into what I mean by those three things. And I think the key emphasis I want to make throughout this is that I'm mainly here, as Anna mentioned, in my capacity to ask questions. It's normally the podcast guest that then provides the answers. And so it's very much a space where I'd encourage people to ask questions and add their own thoughts, because I'm definitely still searching. So in terms of starting off, as Anna mentioned, so 3 years ago, I left the UK and went over to Kenya to join an organization, a DFID-funded organization there. And I arrived and I found myself suddenly surrounded by a lot of expats, as Nairobi is quite a prevalent concentration. And I had a really great time kind of just exploring and meeting other people, and kind of along the way found that I was kind of falling into tropes of many expats. And so not only would kind of this characterize expats instead of migrants, and why do we term each other differently? But also secondly, in this instance, a younger version of myself foolishly trying to get the background, but taking a photo in front of, children and their toilets, and the insensitivity and the ignorance that requires. And so I think I began to realize, mainly thanks to friends and Kenyan friends in particular, some of these issues that I was myself characterizing. And so kind of making mistakes along the way. And here, Lorraine is just on the right-hand side. And Lorraine was a close friend of mine, initially a colleague, and we had a chance to do a lot of work together. And in some instances, I'm vegan, but this was us visiting a Zambian butchery. So we had a lot of shared painful experiences together and discussions as well, which really opened my eyes up. And her vulnerability and kindness to share with me is really what's brought me kind of to today. And so what I found in that was kind of two generalizations and observations in the broad aid development space. And so the first of which was that aid was not necessarily having the intended impact. Huge amounts would go in, and you do see things in spaces. There are really great initiatives like the likes of SEI sound like it. At the same time, there was a lack of scalability, and a lot of the funds just seemed to disappear into the ether. One such example is Play Pumps initiative in 2006. It won the World Bank Prize. It got a lot of attention, a lot of focus, because it was this innovative idea of getting kids to be able to play in their local villages on these playground things that would essentially enable a pumping of the water from the borehole through a filter to get clean drinking water. Now, the idea was great. It got $70 million, $60 million of funding, from 10 of which was from the US government. So it became popular, it became prominent. And yet, after 3-4 years, they quickly realized that it was both falling into disrepair because they hadn't built a network of repair shops. The tooling that was required was specific to this, not general across the region that they were working in. And similarly, you had to have something ridiculous. It was like 24 hours of children going nonstop around these wheels. So it defaulted, unfortunately, to a lot of the women in the villages having to do this work, tiresome and not efficient. And so I think it's quite a good example, albeit a bit of an extreme one, of good ideas, which are, in the end, don't play out. And I think it's that participatory approach that Serena mentioned that's really crucial in the approach of development. And this project shut down in 2010 as a result. The second finding of this was essentially that things that were evidently obviously true for me were obviously wrong for Kenyans. So this is myself with John, who I'd go to his kibanda, it's the name for a kind of roadside restaurant in Kenya, and I'd go to his place every lunchtime for 2 years. And I started to notice that there was right next door a club that would play music, have drinks, and people would go to that and it'd be really buzzing one day a week. And I started to think, well, I'm from the UK, and what's really popular after people going out is people buying fatty foods, and they're drunk, which means that they're very price insensitive. So you can ask them for quite a lot, and they don't necessarily, care for quality, and they'll want a lot of it. So I was really convinced. I thought, this is John, look, this is a great opportunity. I think this could be a really good one. So he was a bit hesitant, but I said, I'll support this first one, and we can trial it and see how we go. So I came to his shop. This is me working with him for a few hours, making the samosas. And then into the evening, I was there holding a sign up and inviting people to buy some samosas. Now, quickly what occurred was that after 1 or 2 hours, people started coming a bit more, but at the same time, then we suddenly had 2 policemen come, and they were questioning me. They were asking a lot of questions. They were wanting to take me to the station. And what had occurred was essentially that whilst John did have a quasi-legal permit to be able to work in there, the issue was that the club was also trying to sell their chips and fries to their customers. And so they didn't really appreciate this alternative business. And the point was that quickly, we had to stop this initiative at least, and John was right. And it just highlighted to me that there were things that I thought, surely this will work, and very quickly realized surely it wouldn't. And it was only something that was evident to Kenyans, in particular John, that I was blind to. So I think it's particularly those 2 aspects, this notion that aid wasn't really having the intended impact, and led to questions of, okay, well, how does one create accountability and feedback in the systems from beneficiaries or the users of systems to be able to voice discontent and have some accountability. And then the second one, which was Kenyans knew this, expats, myself included, were largely ignorant of our flaws. And so why couldn't Kenyans share? Why weren't they able to? What were in the spaces we were created? And what were the consequences to this, to the programs, to the policies, to the organizations that worked? So this is what led me to also kind of want to push. And after definitely quite a few months of being happy to talk about this issue and complain about this issue, to try to contribute in some way. And that took 2 forms. One is Kati Kati, which is an early stage social venture that I'm working with 2 professors in Cambridge, and it's around how does one use a communication channel primarily through SMS to enable an accountability feedback mechanism to handle conversations, not just with a few, but with thousands of individuals of an organization and their users, to be able to dissect that information and then respond to it in an appropriate manner. And the second of which is the Development Dilemma podcast. And so what I thought I would do today is share a few clips from what I've learned from others and their voices into that. So the first thing was context, not knowledge. Now, there's contextual knowledge, and so therefore it's not knowledge in a blanket statement, but it's definitely this notion that we need to be heavily investing in contextual understanding and the value in recognizing that, as opposed to academic. So what you will hopefully now hear is a clip from the first episode I did of the podcast, which was with Lorraine, who I mentioned earlier. And so she kindly came on and shared 2 pieces I'll share with you now.
I wish experts would come into Kenya as if they were walking into someone's home. And when you walk into someone's home, you don't walk in thinking how many things are wrong with the home. You're first of all just happy to have been invited. You kind of walk in with an open mind. I wish more experts would come into the country like that.
And so hopefully you guys heard that. And what I found really evocative with what Lorraine shared is just this notion that we tend to, as expats, come in with a whole sense of baggage and privilege and importance. And with that, then subsequently, complaining about the traffic, or be it heat or systems in place, and how they don't work to our expectations. And the power that Lorraine shared in that quote is this notion that you are walking in someone else's home. And that connotes a sense of respect, of gratitude, that you first are just thankful that you've been invited and you've been allowed in. And then from there can work towards more. But it is taking that approach and recognizing the intelligence, the understanding, and having a humility to that. Something I think she shared really nicely later in the episode in what I'll share now.
And I think then it feeds into this whole idea that experts have that Kenyans aren't as competent as they are, as the experts are.
Because it's molded. In the end, of course, someone else having to match your style is going to do your style worse than
exactly. And you start to say, I just have to keep giving them guidance. No, you have to keep making me into you. And that is a tiring exercise.
And so here the topic was beyond just how we kind of engage, but also in the workplace, where in a lot of these international NGOs, the focus is, and the standards of excellence of performance are heavily based on Western norms. And so here was the fact that we have a lot more of a written approach to communication, whereas in Kenya, there's a lot longer tradition of oral communication and the importance of that. And so it meant that if we expected, in some cases, all Kenyans to match our style and write in our style of writing, they were not going to be able to. In all cases, there are exceptions. But just because of differences, cultural differences, they weren't going to be able to express themselves as well. And we would look down upon them as a result. And all of this worked to create a feeling, particularly for Lorraine and others, that their voices, their expression wasn't valued and they would disengage. So that was kind of this notion of context versus knowledge in the academic sense. The second was this idea of approach and not purpose. So I think that it's difficult because in the charity space, there's a philanthropic desire, there's a benevolence and altruistic goals. And that is really nice, but I think at times it has a consequence to how we see it and how we hold ourselves to account. So the first thing I'll share is from episode 2, and this was with Sarah, a friend of mine. She was an expat and she lived in Kenya for a year. And in that time, she became so uncomfortable with the ways in which development was being approached in her institution, but also amongst friends, that she ended up leaving and going back to the US because she felt it was a more appropriate place.
There's another quote that I love from Lila Watson, who is an Indigenous Australian woman, where she says, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let us work together." And I think this quote is so thought-provoking. And part of why I love it is because I've known it for years and it evokes new meaning often for me. But I think it's such to many people, a radical idea. And it literally doesn't make sense to a lot of people. Like, what do you mean that? Like, how could the person that I'm helping, how could my well-being be like intertwined with theirs? Like, that's just so like opposite of the ethos of like, I give, you receive.
And here Sarah was really highlighting this kind of give and take narrative that's really core to a lot of development approaches. And the fact is that we often sit on the give side, so we get the benefits and the feeling of that, but there are others on the take, and they have to, in our narratives, in our discussions, be the ones receiving this and then, eminently grateful for it, regardless of it. And Marion shared the issues of that and how she felt it. And so here she shared this.
Deeply more, it's that notion that we've come out of sort of altruistic purposes. And I think that notion is normally very dangerous because that's not necessarily what, a country necessarily needs. It's not that we as a country would be seeking for charity, that we are looking for some kind of charity. We are looking for many people to come in and help us to do things. I mean, there are lots of capable people in this country. There are a lot of people who are smart and intelligent and driven and who can actually do the work, right? So we do need people to come in with a different notion, a notion that we're coming to understand the context, we're coming to understand the country, we're coming to understand the people, and we're coming to work alongside them for the betterment of the country. So,
and yeah, I can't say better than Marion, I think. And so that emphasis on work as opposed to helping is really important. And of course, these things are intertwined, but distinguishing that and thereby seeing your commitment to the job you're delivering on. And lastly, I just want to share this last element and last podcast quote, which was a really interesting discussion on the language of development. And I think that there's a lot to be said around the words we use, particularly in the practitioner space, that in jargon we kind of confuse and in some purposes use that confusion to our own benefits. But it also reduces the dignity and the agency of the other person on that side. So I'll share just a small clip.
The idea of being on the ground or in the field is, I think, really very fascinating to me. Because people say it all the time that like, oh, I'm on the ground in Africa. And does that imply that when you go back to like Europe or the US that you're somewhere in the air? I mean, I think there is like a bit of an ivory tower connotation to that, but it just feels like you're floating versus you're like, on the ground.
And so in this emphasis, of course, it seems difficult, but it's that notion that I think stemming away from the slightly more academic space of development and the quite top-down approach of observing, studying people, to giving them the recognition, the dignity, treating them in our approach as whole individuals that we consider to be intelligent and worthwhile to engage in a discussion of how do we improve with them our lives, our liberation together. So the third aspect that I'll emphasize, and this is probably the little bit more controversial one, which is friendship and not networks. And so what I think I found in my experiences has been that what I've benefited most from has been the friendships in Kenya from people who have been comfortable enough to tell me, Arnav, what you just said was completely wrong, or your understanding of the situation is terrible. And it's only been through friendship and through building time and common experiences that they've been kind enough and comfortable enough to share that, particularly in a space where there are kind of power dynamics in the job, etc. And that has been really crucial to what I've learned, and similarly breaking down perceptions I've had of who they are, and similarly the flip side. Kenyans understandably have a lot of perceptions of who expats are, why we are there, and the benefits that we have. And breaking that down through friendship has been a really powerful form. And that's what the podcast hopes to do, is continue those conversations to build an empathy from both sides and ultimately a trust, because I'm personally not very convinced that it's about finding smarter, more intelligent answers as opposed to building a trust in the collaborations, in the implementation of our ideas and practices. So this slide is a beautiful piece of art by Vidusha Yadav, and her other 5 pieces are shared on the Development Dilemma's social media, but it really covers this notion of equitable partnerships. I won't sit on this too long, but I really recommend you find it. It's an Oxfam piece that's really wonderful, and it covers so many of the issues in a lovely visual form of contextual sensitivity to disrupting power imbalances. And so I'll end today with asking and hoping you'll join the conversation further. You can see and find the podcast in many places, and just reach out to me, be it by email, on Instagram, on Twitter, wherever that may be. Please feel free to reach out. And these are some of the books and magazines that I've found have shaped my learning and journey, and some of which might be of interest. And lastly, if anyone's interested, it's at the moment just me with a podcast recorder. And so if people are interested to collaborate, to share, to help with this initiative, then please reach out, and I'd love to hear anything. So thanks a lot for this, and look forward to any questions and ideas.
That's great. Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing some snippets of the podcast. I was hoping you would do something like that. Okay, so we're going to transition over to the Q&A. We have some questions.